and then it just so happens that like the news is very focused on sort of sudden changes, and the sudden changes happen to be negative mostly.
Welcome to Mind the Shift. My name is Anders Bolling. I'm your host. In today's episode, we will try to raise our view significantly and discuss things like why we fail to see progress, why we fail to plan for a long-term future, and why we fail to help the world in an effective way. My guest today is Stefan Schubert, a researcher of psychology at the University of Oxford in England. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anders. I'm happy to be here.
You're actually a philosopher, right? And from Sweden. Can you tell us a little about how you ended up in Oxford, and tell us also about your current research?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, so it's quite a long story. So basically, I'm involved in the effective altruism movement. So effective altruism is this idea. It's like a philosophy, but it's also a social movement that's about doing good as effectively as possible. So many people do good, they donate to charity and so on, but they don't necessarily always think about effectiveness so much. So effective altruists, they argue that well, just like we are effective uh, by and large as investors or like private companies, they're trying to maximize profits, and they're effective in that sense. So like we as donors and charities and so on should also be effective. So I got involved in this movement in 2014, and then I moved to Oxford to start working for an effective altruist organization. And currently, I'm doing research then on effective altruist themes.
So it's your engagement in this organization, in this movement, that has led you to Oxford, and you can actually work at the university
Yes.
as a member of this movement.
Yeah, it's slightly more complex. So what happened was that I moved to Oxford in 2016 to work for Center for Effective Altruism, which is basically like the central organization of the effective altruist movement that sort of organizes the annual conferences, and they have the sort of the effective altruist forum and so on. It's sort of at the heart of the effective altruist movement. And so I worked there for 2 years as a researcher, and then I left to start working at the university, but I continued working on effective altruist themes. And specifically then, I, even though like you said, like I'm a philosopher by training, I joined this psychology lab, the social behavior and ethics lab, but they're working sort of in the intersection between philosophy and psychology. And specifically, they're studying sort of lay people's views of questions of philosophical and ethical significance. So we're studying questions like why don't lay people donate effectively? Why isn't like effective altruism already sort of like a thing, or like that's more widely spread, and like what are people's views of the long-term future, which effective altruists find important as well.
But you started your philosophy studies in Sweden, is that correct?
Yeah, I did
Stockholm.
all my studies in Sweden. So first at Stockholm University. So I'm from Stockholm, and then I moved to Lund in southern Sweden to do my PhD, and then I moved to England actually to do a postdoc at London School of Economics. So it was during that time at London School of Economics that I discovered effective altruism.
Yeah. Effective altruism it's a fascinating concept. So what is wrong with people's giving? Why is it ineffective, and what's the reason behind this ineffectiveness? What's the psychological and the philosophical basis for not for failing to give effectively, and what is giving effectively, basically?
Right. Yeah. So uh, it's a bit of a puzzle why people give ineffectively, because like they're sacrificing a lot for the sake of others, right? So like American giving, it's like I saw some figure that it's like 2% of GDP. So like it's substantial amounts, but then people don't make sure that this money end up with the most effective charities. So it's a bit of a puzzle. I mean, it would be more understandable maybe if people hadn't donated at all. Like, you know, that's just selfishness. But people aren't just purely selfish. Like, they don't want to help others, but then they don't make sure that the money make the maximum amount of impact. So yeah, so like one way to think about it is that it's partly just that they don't know about the most effective charities, and they don't know how to donate effectively. They're sort of looking at the wrong things. Like, so what some people, they're focusing a lot on charities overhead, you know, the administration costs. So but actually that's not as important as many people think, because like unfortunately you can be quite ineffective even though you don't have large administration costs, and vice versa. Like, you know, you might have to recruit you know, talented people whom you have to pay larger salaries. So like you might have to train people, and that's like, you know, it incurs overhead costs. So like higher overhead costs can actually increase effectiveness or something. So that's the one aspect they don't know about how to do it effectively. But then there are also studies that show that like even if you tell people, like, you know, for instance, arthritis charities, like, you know, these joint diseases, they are more effective than cancer charities. Well, just hypothetically in the study, but if you tell them that, then they still want to donate to the cancer charity, because they have sort of this preference.
They feel more sorry for people having cancer than people
Yeah, maybe. Or
having
maybe
arthritis.
they you know, have family members who died from cancer, or maybe like it's because cancer is more widely talked about. But it's not just this cancer versus arthritis case. It's like more general trend that like people often have these charities that they prefer, even when they're told that they are less effective. So that's the other aspect. So first there is like the lack of knowledge, but then there are these sort of subjective preferences, as some people have called them. That people have preferences for certain charities, and so they want to donate to them, even if they're told that they're less effective. But then, so that those are sort of two causes. But then I think there's something else which is sort of in the background, which is that there's this sort of norm, which is that, well, it's your right to donate wherever you want. Like, if you're told that this charity is more effective and you would do more good if you donated to that than this other charity that you prefer, then you're not obliged to choose that more effective charity. So, like, it's not just that you feel that you want to donate to this cancer charity, for instance. Like, other people also say, "Well, go ahead. It's your money. Like, it's totally fine." And interestingly, there was this paper on this. They found that there was a difference in people's perceptions of donors and people in sort of positional responsibility. So, for instance, a president of a medical research center, like, they were supposed, these people in positions of trust, they are supposed to go with what's most effective. So they can't just go with whatever they feel like, you know. But donors can. So there's a difference there, in that, like, you know, the donors aren't really responsible for the outcomes, and therefore they can just go with whatever they feel like, and they're even encouraged to.
So how is it possible to change the way the charities work, for instance, in order for people to be able to give more effectively? Is it that the charities should change, or is it that the mindsets of ordinary people should change, which I suppose would be a lot more difficult, of course?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I would say it's a tall order. It's difficult because, like, effective altruism has been around, and depending on how you count, like 10 to 15 years or so. And like there are a fair number of effective altruists, and there are larger number of people who sort of are not maybe committed effective altruists, but sort of donate to effective altruist charities. Just they look at the website and they find what the most effective charities are. But still, the numbers are relatively small, and
Mm.
unfortunately, I don't expect that to change fundamentally anytime soon. So, but I do expect and hope, for this mindset to slowly spread, but
Mm.
it won't be
But in the
something that
community of
magically.
charities and organizations, something might happen. Some change might happen, perhaps, if they became more aware of the importance of effective giving, or maybe they are so entrenched in their old ways of doing things, their old habits, that they are reluctant to think in new ways.
Yeah, so one issue I think is, and like you asked also before, like what is effectiveness, and that is a quite tricky question. So, uh, basically, if a charity is ineffective, that can be either because like it has a given goal and it sort of just pursues that goal in sort of ineffective ways because they have like incompetent staff or so. But then the other way in which they can be ineffective is because they've chosen a problem or a cause, as some people call it, where it's just very difficult to make progress.
Hmm.
So, like, there are some problems, like for instance, in with regards to diseases. Like
Yeah.
very much not an expert on that, but there are studies that show that there's some diseases you can just make much more progress on with less dollars ultimately, like malaria, for instance, because there are these like you know quite easy interventions like handing out bed nets, whereas what other diseases it's just much harder to make progress on. So I think lots of the differences in effectiveness, they actually come from like what problem people have chosen, not from how
Mm.
effective or how ineffective they are at sort of working on that problem. And I think like often when people think about ineffectiveness, then they think about someone who is like, incompetent at working at a specific cause. They're not thinking of like them having chosen the wrong course, as it were. And I also think that people, they don't want to change course. Like basically, they have sort of chosen their course and they committed to it, and they feel strongly about it. And so that's something that effective altruists argue for, that one should be sort of course neutral
Mm.
instead of choosing from the start which course to work on, like for instance climate change or malaria or what have you. You should sort of look at all the causes with a neutral mindset and think, well, now I'm going to compare all of these causes with each other, and then I'm going to calculate which one is the most effective, and then I'm going to choose that one. So, and how does one do that? Well, that's obviously like there are measurement issues here. What one way to measure it is in terms of how much welfare you create, like how much um, well-being. So, and like obviously, for instance, better health, that would be one aspect of well-being, but it's not the only one. So charities that don't try to promote better health, they can also be measured through like what other ways they sort of promote happiness and well-being.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty complicated process to find out what's the most effective and what's most what would be the best. But I think you have to give us a couple of examples here to see what you're talking about. I mean, can you give us a clear and good example of a very effective charity, for instance, and another one that is not so effective?
Yeah, so so I'm not actually like an expert on these sort of charity evaluations, and it is really tricky to establish charity effectiveness.
But maybe there is
so like,
something that is obvious,
right,
some example that is obvious.
But just so that's clear. But anyway, so there's one charity that's often mentioned, which is this Against Malaria Foundation, which hands out bed nets in some African countries, if I understand correctly. So yeah, basically like malaria spreads via these mosquitoes, which bite people, and then it's very simple intervention. You just hand out these bed nets, and people, they put them up next to their bed, and then they don't get bitten by the mosquitoes, and then they don't get malaria. So and then so Will MacAskill, he has this book Doing Good Better, which I much recommend. So there, the sort of quintessential example of an ineffective charity there is this play pump, where like I think the idea was that you should be able to sort of pump up water via a sort of play pump, where people would just, or like children would just they would play, and they would on this play pump, and then water would get up, would be lifted up through this well. I don't remember the exact mechanics of how this would work now, but basically this was like one of these ideas that sound great on paper, but then it didn't work at all, and women actually had to do this themselves, if I remember correctly. Like the children weren't playing, or like too weak, whatever. So that, but yeah, so that is one example.
Yeah, I also read William MacAskill's book, and I think we can mention the title once again, Doing Good Better.
Yeah,
it's an excellent book. So, and I also actually interviewed him for an article for the newspaper I was working for, but a few years ago. And I was fascinated by the whole movement and this concept of effective altruism. I hadn't heard of it before that, but I understand that it was not completely new at that time. But I am fascinated, and I think it's really something that we all should actually consider more, if not perhaps go all in. I'm not convinced, but I think we should go further in that direction, in my opinion. One thing that I was thinking a bit about when I read the book and afterwards also is that it seems a little bit, and I think you were actually scraping on that surface before when you were talking about the difficulty in pinpointing what is effectiveness, because it seems sometimes a little bit technical, maybe, and paradoxically a little bit dehumanized, perhaps, which is, I guess, one reason why people are reluctant to just look at this very, very scientifically. An example is the beggar on the street. In the streets, we have in Sweden, like in many other European countries these days, beggars from Romania and Bulgaria sitting in the streets. And as far as I remember, William MacAskill said, when I asked him about that, he said that, oh, that's not a very effective way of being altruistic, handing out money to people sitting there. But I think, in a way, I mean, you get a connection between two people, two human beings. When you meet this person, you can. I personally think that the best way of doing it is to actually establish human contact. So you have eye contact with this person, you can even talk to them, and I think you don't even have to give anything. actually to make this person a little bit less unhappy and being. I mean, there's a value in this person realizing that he or she is being seen by somebody else, and then you can give a little something. You can give some money, and I think. I mean, there's a human bond there, human connection that makes you feel that, okay, I know exactly where this money is going, or at least I think so, because I know this person, and I know that this person is a poor person who needs money. So I want to do this instead of sending my money into a black hole of in some charity that I don't know how they are dealing with things in poor countries. Can you understand what I'm
Yeah,
aiming at
yeah,
here?
I do understand that. So I guess there are two things I want to say. So one thing is that I do think it's like partly because of the sort of social role that we have assigned to charity. So I think we have like a slightly different take on like how the government should act, for instance. So we like with government officials, we don't think that they should just hand out money to whoever they happen to see in the street, but they should take a more systematic approach. And like we don't necessarily find that sort of too dehumanizing, like that. I mean, maybe there is some criticism of that sort of the government takes this sort of more bureaucratic.
Well, in the migration policies, you will find a lot of that kind of discussion.
Right, but I guess people by and large they accept that the government needs to have like general rules, and that's like a good way of approaching things. And I guess that to some extent, like you could say that effective altruists say that, well, we should sort of extend that mindset to individual donors. But then I still I just mean that to be sort of a partial answer. So I think that what you're saying is interesting. So like many effective altruists are utilitarians, but not everyone. And like effective altruism isn't like identical with utilitarianism, but I still think that it's like several of Peter Singer is utilitarian, and many
Yeah.
effective altruists are utilitarians. So, and you know, um, utilitarianism, it's this philosophy that, at least on one reading, it's sort of very hard to live according to for humans. Like, so because like you're supposed then, again, just on one reading, to sort of give away almost all your money until you're as poor as the poorest people on the earth, like, and not prioritize your loved ones, and sort of, and then a bunch of other things also sort of potentially to be willing to engage in sort of crimes, if that I don't actually think that that's what utilitarianism entails, like all things considered. But like on the first like there is one possible interpretation of it that says that. So then you have this ideology, or like this philosophy, which seems then to imply these conclusions, which is like very hard for people to live up to. But then, so somehow we like, ironically, it's sort of like from the utilitarian perspective. Well, if it's impossible for humans to live according to utilitarianism, then that's sort of bad news for utilitarianism. And it's sort of like the utilitarian, because they want to maximize effectiveness, it would actually be more effective from the utilitarian perspective to sort of lower the demands, right? Because like if the utilitarian goes around and says like, well, everyone should donate 95% of their income, and then nobody does that, then like there's very little good that's being done, according
Yeah.
to the utilitarians' own metrics. So it's like then better to reduce the demands, like, so giving what you can has 10% of your income, and maybe you should adjust your message in other ways as well. So, like, uh, with regards to sort of being neutral with respect to all different kinds of causes. So, like, some people might say that, well, when you donate to charity, like if you sit in front of your computer, and you think about all the different charities, then you should choose the most effective one. But you can also sort of have a little extra, donations that you just give spontaneously to people in the street, just because, like, that's what
It feels good.
you do if you're a human or whatever. So my point is that it's sort of a tricky question, like what issues you should just go with a straightforward utilitarian analysis, and what issues you should rather say, no, this is too far reaching, and like we can't take this, and like it's like psychologically unsustainable, and and I think that people within the effective altruism movement are sort of have slightly different views on this, and I find it a complicated issue where, like, psychology is highly relevant for that issue.
Fascinating. Wow. I understand you had something of an aha moment after a couple of years of studying effective altruism. Can you delve a little into that?
Yeah, so what happened was that I discovered effective altruism in 2014, like I said, and then I actually started running these projects on my own, and like actually that might have been when we got in contact the first time, because I started this blog, for instance, that where I analyzed opinion pieces actually in the newspaper that I think you worked at the time.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. So and then I ran like a couple of other projects sort of in the same bucket. I started a network for evidence-based policy and so on. So, and because the way I thought about it was like, well, I discovered effective altruism, and then I was like, well, what can I contribute with? I'm a philosopher, and I have this training in like rationality and good argumentation and so on. So, okay, so these are the things that are natural for me to do. So I did that then for like a year and a half or so. But then I moved to Center for Effective Altruism, and then I guess I realized that my previous projects might have been like a bit naive. I had sort of relied too much on volunteers, and not didn't have like enough organizational structure. They were just much more sophisticated in that. And then the other thing was that I guess effective altruism, it has this sort of high level message about like, well, you should be effective and altruistic, but and I hadn't like really realized how much they had been thinking about, like, or how set they were on specific causes, and in particular maybe that there was such a focus on existential risk and the long-term future, which I think that the sort of turn towards those issues has been even more pronounced in recent years. But already then in 2016, I think, like if you talk to people at Center for Effective Altruism, then they were quite set on those issues.
Okay.
And I hadn't really realized that.
Yeah, those issues, those questions around long-term risks are really fascinating. We'll come back to that, I think.
Yeah.
And I guess it's all interconnected in a way. One thing, or one set of issues, set of problems that I might be interconnected with this psychology around effective altruism that you've just been talking about is something that you and I were in touch about a few years ago, concerning something I have written a lot about, not least in my book, The Cozy Darkness of the Apocalypse. And it is the fact that we humans seem to have a tendency to devote very much time to worry about the misery in the world, which is, I mean, relatively rare, and ignore the ubiquitous good stuff. I mean, there are so many good things happening, or neutral things happening all the time, that there's almost never anything really, really dangerous happening in a person's life, especially not in the rich world today. But nevertheless, people are so focused on these bad things, this misery that obviously exists in the world, but very few people actually experience it. And is we all know that the news is full of this kind of misery. So is it only the media's fault, would you say, or is there some other factors at play here?
Yeah, it's certainly true that the media often focuses on negative news, but to the extent that they do that, I think that's because that's what gets them clicks and so on. So then you have to look at consumers' behavior, right? The media consumers' behavior. So if the current media would change their behavior, presumably they would just be replaced by other media, which would again cater to the same old instincts. You wouldn't really get any change. So yeah, I do think that one aspect is this that like loss aversion idea that people are sort of
Yeah, what is
more
that? Can you explain that a
they're
little bit more?
more
Loss
afraid
aversion.
of
I've heard about that also.
yeah. So they're more afraid of losing than of foregoing gains. So like losing something makes them more upset than not gaining something, and
Mm.
more generally, sort of losses loom very large in our attention. Like we pay a lot of attention to losses. But then I think there's also something which is like maybe not just psychological, and that it's more sort of a structural feature of existence, that like if you build something, it's often gradual over a long period of time. Whereas if you destroy something, that often goes like very quickly. Like, well, obviously, like
Hmm.
wars, they destroy things very quickly, and then you build up things over a long period of time. But also the economy, like the crash of 2008, is very swift, and then it took like many years for unemployment to go down. And then so then um, and then it just so happens that like the news is very focused on sort of sudden changes, and the sudden changes happen to be negative mostly, but the sort of root cause is this focus on sudden changes. And I think that's something else that's not so good about our current media consumption. That is that we're so focused on the sort of day-to-day news as
Mm.
opposed to the longer trends,
Mm.
um, which yeah
Yeah, tell me about it. I mean, I've been an editor and a journalist for many years, and I know that
yeah
any editor can write a negative headline in her sleep. I mean, and
right
but a positive headline is really difficult because, as you say, many of the positive news are things that come gradually. They're slow. Uh,
yeah
but I mean, sometimes they happen, like the fall of the Berlin Wall, for instance. So
yeah
then
yeah
there are
yeah yeah
headlines.
that there are exceptions. And I was actually thinking, like, I had this hypothesis that maybe there are some news where there's like the opposite bias, actually, like tech news, for instance, about like
Tech news and also economy news to some extent, I think.
oh yeah, that could be. But like with tech, then it's sort of like that to say that um, self-driving cars will come next year, that's news, right?
Yeah, that's
So
true.
therefore people talk a lot about that, whereas like saying it will come in 2 decades, or like that's sort of boring, so that's not good news. So there might be like the opposite bias,
That's
I guess.
interesting. Then the bias is inverted. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So that they in that field you want positive news to get headlines. Yeah. So, but it seems to me that this is not very useful for us because it means that people, as far as I can understand, they and I've also written this, so I think it. Uh, People believe that the world is actually worse off than it is, and sometimes I think almost want to have that belief because, for instance, there's a Swedish writer called Lasse Berg. His name is Lasse Berg, and he has written many books about development in Asia, for instance. And when he was talking about that a couple of decades ago, talking to people about it, he held lectures about his book, and his book contained many positive conclusions about what had happened in Asia, and not least in India, between the 1970s and the late 1990s. People had gotten it very much better materially. They had lived a very much better life, and it has many things had improved, and technology and information was better. Everything was better in the villages out in the countryside of India. And when he told people about that, when he spoke about that, he told me that the audience was kind of looked a bit sad. And I mean, they listened and they nodded and they were smiling a little bit, but they didn't look really happy. And then often someone raised their hand at the end of the lecture and asked him, well, there are so many positive things you have to say about this. Aren't there any crises going on in the world? And then he said, oh, well, yes, of course, I think climate change is a real threat. And then it was like a big relief in the audience. Right. Everyone was just, oh, finally he said it.
Yeah.
Thank you. They want to hear that there's a crisis going on. They want to hear. And I've experienced that too. When I wrote my book about this, people were like, well, yeah, it's probably correct what you say, and it's nice and all that, but you can't really think in that way. So, I mean, it doesn't make people happy to tell them that the world is good. Do you follow me? Do you understand what
I'm not sure
about?
that it makes them happy to think that the world is bad either.
No, nothing makes them happy.
No, it doesn't make them happy. But it's some kind of other kind of feeling. I mean, I don't really know why they're thinking about it in this way, but if I am to speculate, so at least one motivation, I think, can be that, well, by saying that things have become much better, you're saying, well, I mean, you're not saying, but people might interpret you as saying that they are pretty good now, and also that sort of they're acceptable now, that we shouldn't do more.
Okay.
So there's like a conflation of these different statements, and that they might think that, well, by saying that things have become so much better, you're sort of like
you're not entitled to ask for anything more.
Yeah, like you're not really morally serious in a way. You're sort of like downplaying the people's suffering or so.
Oh yeah.
I think that's wrong, but
people can get that impression. Yes, I understand.
I think that this Max Roser, this founder of Our World in Data, he wrote this article which was called something like "The world has become much better, but it's still much worse than it should be." Or so. It wasn't exactly that, but like there was something along those lines. And I thought it was a smart idea to have that kind of headline to sort of defeat this implication that, like, by saying that things have become better, I'm thereby also saying that like everything is fine now. I'm not saying that. I think, I mean, in general, I think that in communication, people sort of jump to conclusions about what you believe, like often like beliefs which are, quite far removed from what you're literally saying all the time. So, and I think it's often important when you try to communicate with people, sort of think through what are all these implications now. What can people infer about me, which is not sort of written on the lines, and then.
Do you think this is something new, a new phenomenon, or have humans always thought in this way? That they have focused on the bad things and ignored the good things?
Yeah, I find that difficult. I mean, so for one thing, I guess that like prior to the Industrial Revolution, I guess that there wasn't the same kind of feeling that we're sort of going in.
Anywhere.
Yeah, like I think we're sort
It was
of
so
more of
slow that
this.
they didn't even have the idea of any kind of evolution at all.
Yeah, a
During
little
one
bit.
lifetime, nothing really happened.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, um, I mean, I guess also, like, in fairness, one should say I agree that there is this narrative of like things are getting worse and so on. And I think that was also like, there were early critics of the Industrial Revolution that sort of romanticized the old life and so on. So in that respect, like these kinds of feelings have been there from before. But I also think there's been like tremendous amount of optimism about progress, and there is still like so. So I would rather say there are these sort of two camps which are sort of fighting against each other, and they've done so for at least since the Industrial Revolution.
You have a point there, yeah. You were mentioning the Industrial Revolution and where we have come to now, because one of the starting points of this podcast is that the world is integrating in a way that has never happened before in history, and I find it a bit odd that so few thinkers actually delve into that or take that into account when they are analyzing what's happening in the world. To me, it's really crucial. One crucial thing is that the world is becoming. I mean, we are focusing, as we have said just recently, we are focusing on the problems with that when we are integrating, when countries are interacting much more with each other and people are interacting much more, then there is conflict, then there is friction between groups and friction between countries, and that leads to conflicts, smaller conflicts today than a few decades ago, I would argue, but anyway, conflicts, and
Mm-hmm.
people are scared that war is going to erupt and all that. But nevertheless, there is something happening in the sense that, to the effect that the world is integrating, and I think that's, in my opinion, that is a huge event actually, and which means that we are in crucial times now, and maybe just maybe that is also one reason why people, especially in the West, where we kind of feel like we have come to the end of the road, so to speak, because there are no big ideologies around. There are no, I mean, before, when the world wasn't integrated, you could always expand geographically or culturally or economically. But I mean, we have only this planet, and this planet is, so to speak, full, full of people and full of the economy, full of one culture almost, which means that people get the feeling that where to go now? We have nowhere to go. Nothing's. I mean, that's why they can't really see a future, because they can't visualize what will happen with a world that is completely full of everything.
Mm-hmm.
But you haven't really, when we have spoken before, you haven't really mentioned the fact that we are integrating as a factor, as a factor behind a concept of a crucial time. Do you even think that we live in crucial times? And in that case, in what respect would you say?
Yeah, so crucial times. It's a question that can be sort of answered in several different ways. I guess, yeah, I like if you zoom out a lot, then obviously like any time since the Industrial Revolution is crucial, and like certainly, yeah, so 20th and 21st century, like from a historical perspective, like there's a tremendous amount of stuff happening compared to sort of, I don't know, the 9th century, the 10th century. So but then I'm not sure that like the sort of the second and now the third decade of this century are like especially crucial relative to, say, the second half of the 20th century. Like sort of economic growth was exceptionally high in the sort of first decades after World War II, and then there were all these political developments. There was sort of like the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was like a tremendously large event, and I don't think we've seen like events on that scale more recently. I mean, the one thing which is a very, very important development of historical proportions, that is of course the rise of China, and that will change the geopolitical situation in the world. I think, yeah, that's the one event which I find really, really important.
Well, that's a country and a political system and a nation. But what about technical development, artificial intelligence, GM crops, all that, those things that are happening?
Yeah, like, yes, there are these studies which suggest that sort of economic growth for the last few decades has actually been relatively low by sort of modern standards. And if that's right, then that sort of is probably partially because there have been more sort of technological advances, because technological
Yes.
advances is a big part of why we see economic growth. But I mean, of course, that can change in the future. So that's absolutely possible. But I guess the best evidence of like how it's going to go in the near future, that's like how it's gone in the recent past. And like the recent past suggests that like the
Like
technological
the weather
change is,
forecast.
yeah, and like I said, I do seriously mean that there can be sort of a sort of positive bias with respect to technological development, because there you always hear about like breakthroughs and so on. There's like, well, if something didn't really work as well as they thought, then you're not going to hear as much about it. Like, I mean, with self-driving cars, for instance, I mean, I'm not very much not an expert in it, but it seems like a few years ago there was like tons of reports of like how we're going to see that soon, and now it's not like you're seeing tons of more negative reports. You're just not seeing much news about it at all, and I think that's sort of a common
But
pattern.
hasn't it been like that with every new technical development? Like when the mobile phone arrived in the 90s on a broad scale to the general
Right.
public, it had been in the pipeline for 30 years or something.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Self-driving cars might come sooner than I might expect. So that's definitely possible. But I'm just pointing to this general phenomenon that there can be a bias in the sort of positive direction with respect to technological development. But that doesn't rule out that we might see great technological breakthroughs during the 2020.
No. Talking of the future, you mentioned before, and I promised to come back to that, long-term risks,
Yeah,
long-term planning in general, and our inability to actually see the very long term and assess risks in an in a rational and sensible way. You're studying this quite a lot as well, aren't you? And what are
yeah,
your
to
views
some extent.
on that?
Yeah, so like I think there's a quite interesting sort of collision here of sort of different debates and different ideas. So like you have studied these people who are sort of focused a lot on risks and problems, basically because they're sort of quite pessimistic in general. Like they're always focusing on the negative. So it's sort of like this like sort of a bit negative pessimistic mindset, right? But then I would say that like, well, within effective altruism there is like then a subset of effective altruism, but like a large subset which is focused on the long-term future, because they think that well, the most effective way of doing good is to help making sure that the long-term future becomes as good as possible. And the reason for that is that like the future can be so long and so good that like if we manage to influence that then can sort of dwarf any interventions that we can do that sort of help people who are alive today. So So
What are the timescales we're talking about here?
yeah, like millions of years potentially. Yeah,
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, in principle, like there's humanity could live on. Um, but anyway, so there is this like sort of abstract argument for why the long-term future is very important. But then you come to the next problem, which is like, well, how can you influence the long-term future? And that's very difficult. Like if you, like so one way of making that clear is to think, well, what if you lived in the Roman era, like 2000 years ago, and you were trying to influence things like 2020? Like how would you do it? It would be very difficult. Like, well, you can try to sort of
That's a good question. Yeah.
reform laws or something, but like you could bet that those laws would just be gone by 2020. So there's a general problem that like whatever you do, it might just be reversed later on, and so it's very unclear what one can actually do to sort of change the long run course of the world. But one thing one can know, that is that like if humanity goes extinct, then it will stay extinct. So so because like there's a difference there between like extinction prevention and many other things that you can do. That there is like a greater degree of certainty that like your actions will have a long run effect. At least that's uh, what you might think like as a first pass. So for that reason, effective altruists and long-termists, they've said that well, extinction prevention and that may be something very effective. So so this line of thinking is sort of like you're coming to uh, you interested in extinction risks, but for very different reasons than from these like more pessimistic people. It's not because you have this like pessimistic negative mindset. No, it's more like, well, you think that the future can be very 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 good. Like you're very optimistic about that future. So like Nick Bostrom, for instance, who is like very much a leading advocate of this approach. He has this article which I think is called "Letter from Utopia," where it sort of writes about like how great things could become in the future. So it's very much not this negative or pessimistic mindset, but it's more like combination of being optimistic about the future, but then also realizing that there might not be so many things we can do now to influence the long run future. But one thing that we can do is to reduce extinction risk. But of course,
So what are
you,
those? Can you give an example? Is it asteroids, for
yeah,
instance?
well, asteroids is a potential risk, but it's small. So Toby Ord, who is another researcher who works closely with Bostrom, he has recently written this book called The Precipice on the different existential risks. So existential risks are extinction risks plus risks that threaten to sort of permanently curtail humanity's potential. So like we
So
maybe
we
we're
would eventually go extinct anyway,
we need not
or
go
more or
extinct,
less
but we can sort of we will
not
remain at the
thrive.
sort of we won't thrive, yeah, for some reason. Anyway, so this book, which I recommend, it's sort of provides an overview over the existential risks, and Toby he thinks that I think he says that there's a 1 in 6 chance that humanity will go extinct this century, and then he says that the largest risk comes from artificial intelligence, which he says is 1 in 10, so 10%, and then there are risks from synthetic biology. So, for instance, an engineered virus, which is like 3% or so, and then I think there was like an unknown risks, which was 3%, and then the rest were sort of very small the risks from other causes.
Yeah,
So, for
to the
instance,
extent that so to the extent that I've read about these kinds of risk assessments, I have noted that climate change is almost never mentioned in
yeah,
this context.
yeah, no, it's true. Like, well, Toby has like a chapter or like quite a few pages on climate change, but then I think he comes down to saying that it's like a fairly small risk. I don't remember the exact number now, but it's not zero, but it's but
But then you
you
have to
have
remember that this is the extinction risk, or the risk of
exactly.
humankind coming down to a level of not being able to thrive at all. It doesn't mean that it's not a risk that we will have problems.
Yeah, exactly. And then you can also, of course, discuss like, well, maybe if there is a catastrophe sort of caused by climate change, then that might sort of cause some kind of political instability, and that might lead to wars, which can lead to something else. And so those sort of indirect effects are, of course, important to think about, but they're very hard to predict.
But what would the action be? What's the recommendation? Uh, where to take action, so to speak, in order to prevent these extreme extinction risks to happen from happening?
Yeah, I think that you have to look at each particular risk and think like, what can we do about this particular risk? So, I mean, with artificial intelligence, for instance, people are now doing sort of technical research to develop AI systems that are more safe, or sort of also maybe to some extent also just prepare for future such developments, sort of like trying to look at the which ways do we want to go in order for these systems to become safe. Like, it's early days, but you want to prepare, and also to think about legislation and things like that, and governance. And yeah, with bio risks, that I'm very much not an expert, but yeah, obviously, like, legislation matters there as well. I guess it's often like trying to become an expert on the technical details, and then once you and also to sort of get in a position of influence, and then trying to sort of push things in a more safety oriented direction.
Okay, so how do you think it will all end up in the end? Uh, it will all go in the end. But I mean, you don't have to answer for how it's going to go in 1 million years, but maybe the coming centuries or so. Would you say that you're an optimist or a pessimist?
Yeah, so if I just had to give it a yes or no like answer to that, I would say I'm more on the optimistic side. Like, I do buy this view that, like, well, many people have argued for, like, well, Steven Pinker in Enlightenment 2.0 is called, right? That, like, well, lots of things have become better, and like we have reason to believe that they will continue to get better. But then I also find sometimes that this debate between the sort of optimists and pessimists, it's somewhat unfortunate, because it becomes like almost like, well, you're on this team and like you're on that team. It becomes like a bit almost tribal, a bit like, liberals versus conservatives. Well, not on that level maybe, but so I would rather sort of think that, well, one should sort of try to analyze each issue on its own merits. There are some things which don't seem necessarily to go in the right direction right now, like, like we touched upon before, like the geopolitical situation seems to be worse now than it was in the 90s, for instance, and who knows, that could very well continue to get worse. I do, with respect to risks, I do think that there's one sort of psychological consideration which some people sometimes miss. So, which is that, like, precisely because people are so afraid of catastrophes and they're so focused on risk, they often don't occur because, like, people will take action against them. So there's something that I have called like a sleepwalk bias. So you're sort of assuming that people will just sleepwalk into disaster, but that's just not true. If we look at history, for instance, like, well, people have worried about many things. Like, well, obviously there's like population explosion, which is widely discussed, but there are also other things like that very many countries would get nuclear weapons, but they actually managed to prevent that, and like much fewer countries have nuclear weapons now than they once feared, which is great, obviously, because it lowers the risk of nuclear war. So, and then there's the ozone layer where action also was taken. So I think that that gives us some reason to believe that various risks might be lower than you sort of naively
That's
might
a
think.
silver lining to the negativity bias then.
Exactly, there is a bit, but the tricky thing is, of course, like, you can't say to people like, well, you don't have to do anything because they will just take care of themselves. Like, no, it's just because people care about it, because people do take action. That's why they're gonna, to some extent, they're gonna address it. I also think that, like, you don't have to have necessarily this like extremely negative mindset in order to sort of address risks in this way. And I think people often necessarily didn't have that, like those people who address these risks rationally. I mean, you could just, I mean, you don't have like to be super emotional in order to.
No, I think it's the opposite. But I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying, and it's interesting. I think optimists are often better at bettering the world than pessimists. I mean, if you're a hardcore pessimist, then you don't take action, of course, because then you're not a pessimist. If you take action, you're not a hardcore pessimist.
Right. Yeah.
So you have to have some kind of notion that things might get better, and so there's a point in me trying to make it better.
Right.
So I know Hans Rosling, the Swedish professor who was traveling a lot and talking about the bettering of the world. He didn't want to call himself an optimist, and I always thought that was a bit. He was a bit intellectually vain, I think. He wouldn't admit that, but he called himself a possibilist because a better word is possible. But I wouldn't say I'm sure that it's going to happen. But I think people are too afraid to call themselves optimists because I mean I think it's the only. I'm talking about my personal view now. It's the only responsible way of looking at the world. It's to be an optimist, because if you're an optimist, you think that things are going to work out, and that's why you walk into the future with a mindset that is creative. You can create things, because I think you might say what you think about this, but I think that what people have in their minds, what they think they want to create, what they want to create, what they want to manifest, what they are focusing on, that is also what is going to happen. I mean, nothing can happen in this world that has to do with humankind that has not been the figment of some people's or some groups of people's imagination. It wouldn't happen if it wasn't. What do you think about that?
Right. So then you're saying that one should be an optimist in the way that one should sort of like be imaginative and sort of imagine these positive scenarios, because if one doesn't imagine these positive scenarios, then one is not going to work towards them, and then they're not gonna be realized.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I guess they
nothing is created that isn't created in a person's mind first. Often from some kind of love. I mean, love is a big word, but you might have love for this project that your pet project that you want to create, and then you just do it, and all of a sudden it's there, and everyone, whoa, fantastic! Now we can fly without petrol, or I don't know, something.
Right, but
fantastic happens.
Yeah, I guess First of all, I do think there are sort of fallacies which optimists are prone to make. Like, I mean, I guess I don't know about Neville Chamberlain, you know, the appeasement
Yes, peace in our
prime
time.
minister. Like, if he was like generally an optimist, but he certainly was too optimistic regarding Hitler's intentions. Like, so it should have been more pessimistic. And I mean, there are many examples like that where like people have been negligent of risks. Um, so I'm not saying that like that's something that's necessarily a feature of optimism, but it is something to be on the lookout for. The other thing, like one view one could have, is of course that, well, you might want to have like some element of diversity, right? So there's this idea that like, well, why are some people so neurotic and pessimistic? Well, that was because, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying this is true, but this is a story you might tell, that like on the savannah, like there were some light sleepers who like woke up when the lions were around, and like, you know, they saved the rest
Yeah,
of,
I can understand
of the
that.
group. So,
Why not?
and like similarly, you know, it might be good to have like some people who are like more pessimistically inclined, to sort of, who are on the lookout for.
Yeah, what I can appreciate very much. I'm a fairly I take action pretty easily, I think, normally. But I more and more appreciate people who, so to speak, put on the brakes sometimes, because it's a good thing to sometimes look up and look around and see what has been going on, and if you might, as you say, have missed some kind of hurdles or some kind of problems that you didn't see on beforehand. So the break, what do you call them? The people who put on the brakes, they are very much needed sometimes. So that's, I don't know if you want to call them pessimists, but they're perhaps realists.
Yeah.
Very much needed.
Right.
Okay, so you anyway, you think that it's going to end fairly well, all things considered.
Yeah, like
Basically,
it's very difficult to say. I don't necessarily think that the risk of extinction is overwhelmingly high here over the in the near future. Um, I probably would think it's like somewhat less likely than what Toby Ord would say in his book. So he said there was like 1/6 in this century, if I remember correctly. But like one thing that I worry about, which is also related actually to this loss aversion idea, is that we will sort of not advance that much either. Like certainly we will make sort of technological progress, but we might not sort of do that much to sort of permanently improve the security situations, so permanently reduce the risk of war. So like, you know, now we've had nuclear weapons for 75 years. 75 years.
yeah.
And like that's very bad, because like every year there is a certain risk, and you could argue that, well, sooner or later it might erupt into war because of an accident or something. So but and like, yeah, also in other ways, like we aren't seeing so much more international cooperation, that we haven't seen that much more of that, like in the post-war period. It's, well, there are
Maybe there
some
is something
developments.
going on beneath the surface, because we are looking very much on what is happening between world leaders all the time. But
Yeah,
maybe there are some other movements going on beneath the surface between organizations like Effective Altruism and other big organizations, and even through social media between between citizens of the world, which has not been possible before. So that's I'm just throwing this in here because
no, that's a good point. I mean, like relatedly, there are sort of value shifts which are happening not fast, but so steadily, like so that people's moral values are sort of shifting in a more liberal direction, and this is a global phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And this has and will continue to have like political consequences. So yeah, one could hope for that, but still it seems to me that like nationalist feelings are very, very strong in many countries. And well, in some respects the development is even going backwards from that perspective, with Brexit, for instance. And so I think there's
well, we haven't seen that yet
no,
in practice.
well, let's see. Yeah, but so like all in all, I think there's some chance that the rest of the century we will sort of muddle through. We will not go extinct, or there won't be any sort of extreme catastrophe, and there will be continued economic and progress, and there will be technological advances, but there won't be sort of a drastic change of the sort of political system, which would sort of permanently reduce the risk of war to like very low figures or so, but will continue with this sort of
the muddle through
conflict
theory.
Yeah,
that's what is on the table. Why not? I mean, that's probably better than many people would think. What I personally think, well, doesn't really matter, but it's interesting. Muddle through is not the worst, actually. That's what you often say about the European Union. It muddles through all the time. Right. I mean, its demise has been predicted umpteen times, but it never happens.
Yeah, and I also should caveat with that with saying that, well, maybe muddle through sounds like a bit too negative, because I do think that we're going to see continued GDP growth, and all of these metrics which people have talked about so much, like infant mortality and life expectancy, and all of that's going to continue to improve, and that's going to be great. So yeah.
So a nice and fine and pretty muddle through during the next century, with some advancements on different metrics. Excellent. Nice way to end this interview. Thank you very much, Stefan Schubert, and good luck with your you're welcome, with your very important research on effective altruism and long-term risk assessments.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.